All right, we're going to talk about William James's pragmatism as an alternative theory of the ethics of belief. I'm going to set up James's argument as a response to Clifford's rule, or the way we'll put it is James is giving us an argument against Clifford's rule. Toward the end, we'll see just briefly what the alternative is he lays out. But Clifford's rule, as a reminder, says that it is always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. This is William James. You read his piece, The Will to Believe. James was influential in a lot of areas. He was one of the earliest psychologists. He had a lot of interesting writing on the psychology and sociology of religious belief. He also was the founder of one of the founders of philosophical pragmatism in the United States. James begins with some definitions and concepts. And as I mentioned in class, the definitions and concepts are a little bit hard to get through at first. You're kind of like, why is he drawing all these distinctions? But there is a payoff. And the payoff is, I think, a nice, clean objection to Clifford. So James has this idea of a hypothesis. And a hypothesis, he says, is anything that may be proposed to our belief. So, for example, here's something that can be proposed to your belief. You shall believe in God, or you shall believe that God exists. Here's something else that can be proposed to your belief. You shall believe that God does not exist. That's a proposal. Shall you or shall you not, right? Here's yet another thing that could be proposed to your belief. You shall neither believe that God exists, nor shall you believe that God does not exist. Rather, you shall suspend judgment or remain agnostic. So it's like a proposal. Shall you take it? Will you suspend belief altogether? So there what we have are three hypotheses. Believing in God, believing that God does not exist, or neither. Agnosticism. This is what James means by a hypothesis. So it's very clear from this piece, he doesn't just mean scientific hypotheses. Although sometimes if you're a practicing scientist, you can, or even if you're not for that matter, a hypothesis relating to science can certainly be proposed to your belief. The key distinction to understanding the other distinctions that James makes is between a live hypothesis and a dead hypothesis. A live hypothesis for James is a hypothesis that it's psychologically possible for you to accept. A dead hypothesis for him is one that's not psychologically possible for you to accept. So note that liveness or deadness of hypotheses is always relative to a person. So something that is live for you might not be live for me, or vice versa. There might be a handful of people in the world for whom a given hypothesis is live, and for the rest of us, it's dead. So the liveness and deadness are not absolute notions, but always relative to an individual's psychological capacities. So for example, if you're a committed theist and you simply could not see yourself being moved by any argument, nor indeed by any consideration, to give up your belief that God exists, then for you, the hypothesis, you shall believe that God does not exist, is dead, or you shall become an atheist. Indeed, for you, the hypothesis, you shall be an agnostic, is dead. The only one that's live for you is continuing on with your belief in God. On the other hand, if you're an agnostic and you're somebody who's like, I haven't made up my mind, I'm also open to being persuaded by arguments in one direction or the other, then both atheism and theism for you are live hypotheses. Indeed, trivially, agnosticism is also a live hypothesis because it's something you already do accept. So for you, everything is live. It's kind of all illuminated. Whereas for others, one or the other, or two of the three, one or two of the three may themselves be kind of darkened, and only one might be lit up or electrified, is the way James puts it, and be live for you. An option, we can use this idea of a hypothesis to define the notion of an option, which is a kind of decision or choice between two hypotheses. So if you are trying to decide, am I going to accept the hypothesis, you shall believe that God exists? Or am I going to accept the hypothesis, you shall not believe that God exists? You're either going to be an agnostic or an atheist. You're trying to make up your mind. What am I going to do, right? Which of these hypotheses will I accept? That's an option. You have a decision to make. Which one will you accept? James then makes these distinctions, further distinctions among different kinds of options. And what he wants to do is draw our attention to a special kind of option. He thinks we go through life facing all sorts of options, whether we know it or not. But there are unique kinds of options that come very rarely and that are really important. And those are the ones he thinks Clifford's rule has implausible implications about. And that if we followed Clifford's rule, Clifford's rule would lead us astray with respect to making up our mind in life's really important moments, these what he later calls genuine options. So he distinguishes first between a live option and a dead one. A live option is a choice between two live hypotheses. He then distinguishes between a forced option and an avoidable one. A forced option is an unavoidable choice between two hypotheses. It's when you have to pick one or the other. An avoidable one is one such that you could pick if you wanted to, or you could just pick neither. It's not forced. And then finally, a momentous option versus a trivial option. A momentous option is an option that is unique and irreversible, and what you choose potentially has great personal significance for you, can either benefit or harm you greatly. So it's a unique and irreversible choice of great personal significance, is the way we'll put it. A trivial option is one such that whichever way you choose, it really doesn't have that big of an impact, positive or negative for you. A genuine option, and these are these rare and special and super important choices we make occasionally in our lives. James says a genuine option is an option or a choice between two hypotheses that is live, such that you can choose one or the other. It's possible for you. It's forced. You have to choose. There's no avoiding it. And it's momentous. What you choose, which hypothesis you accept, has the potential to greatly benefit you or greatly harm you, depending on the choice. It's not something that you can make lightly. He gives a few different kinds of examples of genuine options. Self-fulfilling beliefs. We'll talk about those in a second. Religious beliefs. The main example here is Pascal's wager. And then epistemic norms. We didn't get to this because our schedule was compressed because of the hurricane. So you don't need to know about the epistemic norms one. The two examples of genuine options you should know about are self-fulfilling beliefs and religious belief, or Pascal's wager. I'm not going to go into the details of self-fulfilling beliefs, but the cases that we discussed, two cases that have that kind of structure of self-fulfilling belief. The athlete case, where you're trying to decide, shall I psych myself up into thinking I'm going to win or not? And what you decide there has the potential to impact whether you will win or not, how well you perform in the race. That's an example of a self-fulfilling belief. It's also, depending on the context and depending on how important this is for, say, your professional career as an athlete, it could count as a genuine option for James. James mentions romantic love. I kind of dramatized this example by imagining that you're trying to decide whether to believe that you've got a shot with somebody, even though your evidence is kind of tied either way. And you're believing, you're having confidence in yourself, and believing that you have a shot with them can be actually partly what makes them respond positively to your proposal that you go out on a date, say, or that you just hang out, to be less old-fashioned about it. They might propose more positively if you are a little more confident. So there's another case of a self-fulfilling belief. James also mentioned social institutions. So I think in a democratic society like ours, a lot of social institutions, their function and continued efficacy assumes collective buy-in. Like when nobody trusts that the vote is going to be fair, if everybody thinks that the other side is rigging the vote, that tends to make people turn to non-democratic means of making their voice heard, right? Conversely, if you tend to think that voting is both the best and the fairest means to achieve outcomes you desire, and you trust the system, then you're going to tend to participate in the system and make it function. So I think social institutions, especially in a democracy, are sort of at a larger scale an example of a self-fulfilling belief. Turning to religious belief as an example of a genuine option, I'm not going to go through this again, but as a reminder, this may help you remember the structure of Pascal's wager. In class, I had this silly little example where I had a folded piece of paper, and I asked you, is anything written inside the folded piece of paper? And I told you there are two wagers you can give, yes or no. I asked you, which one do you wager? And I said, before you make your wager, let me tell you about what you can win or lose. And if you say no and you're right, you gain nothing. If you say no and you're wrong, then you lose $1,000. If you say yes and you're right, then you get $1,000. And if you wager yes and you're wrong, then you gain nothing. And all of you very quickly were like, well, of course I'm going to wager yes, because there's nothing to lose if I'm wrong, and I could get $1,000 if I'm right. Whereas there's nothing to lose there's nothing to gain if I'm right with no, and there's quite a bit to lose with no. So obviously the rational thing to do is to wager yes. Pascal's wager says that religious belief, for those people who have not yet been convinced by arguments, so for those people, the way Pascal puts it is, for those of us whose intellect has not yet decided whether to believe in God, belief in God or failure to believe in God is a kind of wager-like choice. And when we turn to the potential practical consequences of belief and non-belief in each case, Pascal claims that just as you should wager yes in the piece of paper case, so too you should wager on God or believe that God exists, not for intellectual or argument-based reasons, but because of the potential payoff practically of doing so. So filling out the chart really briefly, the two options are believe in God or don't believe. So in James's terms, this is an option between the hypothesis believe that God exists and the hypothesis don't believe that God exists, which is inclusive of both atheism and agnosticism. And what we're doing is just considering the possible consequences of both belief and non-belief on option one if God exists, and then on option two if God does not exist. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe, you get nothing, right? If God exists and you don't believe, you potentially get an infinite punishment. That is, you're sort of cast into hellfire forever for being a non-believer. Well, what if you believe and God doesn't exist? Well, I mean, you're wrong, that kind of sucks, but there's no infinite consequences, positive or negative, for that. So we'll just write down a zero. And notice that instead of zero, we could put finite, positive or negative. And Pascal's wager is supposed to, if we were going to spend a whole class on it, we would talk about how it would work regardless of whether you plug in a zero there or some finite number, positive or negative. What happens if you believe in God exists? Well, you'll get an infinite reward or an infinite amount of time in heaven, right? And when you look at this and think, what should I wager? For the same reason that led you to say yes in the folded paper case, Pascal and James thinks the rational thing to do here is to believe that God exists in the case of theism, if it's possible for you to do this. Why is this a genuine option? Well, it is not a genuine option for everybody. It is instead a genuine option for only those people who are finding themselves sort of open to either belief or non-belief. And for those people, both of those two hypotheses are live, so it's a live option. For those people, it is forced, in that if the choice is between believing in God and not doing so, there's no third thing you can do, because not believing in God includes both agnosticism and atheism, right? So if you're like, well, I want to be just an agnostic, well, then you're choosing the don't believe category. You're just choosing one particular version of the don't believe category. And then finally, it's also in addition to being forced for that reason, it's a momentous option. And that's what this table shows, right? What you believe has and whether you believe has great personal consequences for you, positive or negative. William James looks at these kinds of cases and says this: GO1, or premise 1, if Clifford's rule is true, then it's always wrong for anyone who is facing a genuine option to believe. So the thought here, and this was another case that we had to cut short, unfortunately, due to the hurricane. The thought here is that Clifford's rule says it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Now, when we think about individuals in genuine options, those individuals are facing live options. And by definition, it has to be psychologically possible for them to take either hypothesis. So, in those cases, their evidence does not clearly establish one way or the other whether to believe or not, or what to believe, depending on the choice they're making. Because if their evidence did establish, if they had sufficient evidence, say, for theism, in the case of religious belief, it would no longer be a live option. Because non-belief, not believing in God, would be dead for them. The only one that would be available as a live hypothesis would be belief in God. And that's why if Clifford's rule is true, it's always wrong for anyone in a genuine option to believe, because every genuine option is a live option by definition. And in order for an option to be live, the evidence is insufficient. And so if you're believing one way or the other while you're in a genuine option, you're violating Clifford's rule because you're moving beyond the evidence you have. It's the idea behind that first premise. James then says, this is the second premise, it is not always wrong for anyone to believe while they're in a genuine option. That is, in fact, it's not always wrong, he thinks, for somebody to believe or not believe if they're accepting the hypothesis, you shall not believe in God. James's point is that whichever way you go, whatever choice you make there, you haven't done anything immoral. Why? Why is this? One way to think about his defense of premise 2, and we didn't get to this in class, unfortunately, because of the hurricane, but just briefly, and you don't need to know this, but I'm just so you can understand the argument a little better. Really briefly, I think one way of understanding his point is this. Morality can demand quite a bit of us, right? But there's a limit. And any moral theory that implies that we're morally required not just to give up something for the sake of others, but that we're in fact required to give up everything that makes life worth living, or indeed our very lives, or perhaps, even more extreme, we're morally required to give up our immortal soul. That moral theory is way too demanding. And I think James's objection is something like this. whatever our ethics of belief is, it can't demand so much of us, whatever the true ethics of belief is, it can't demand so much of us that it would be wrong for somebody facing a genuine option to make the choice. That can't be wrong, because in a genuine option, what's at stake is momentous. You stand to gain or lose everything. It can't be wrong for you to make that choice. In other words, James is saying our ethics has to take into account the impact on society, but it also has to take into account the impact on the individual. And what Clifford has done is completely neglected the individual's potential, the potential costs and benefits of the individual of belief. And this is in a way why James is a pragmatist, or the sense in which he's a pragmatist. For him, Clifford's rule is in a sense just impractical. If we followed it, we would be sort of paralyzed, not able to ever make up our minds when we're faced with an important choice where we don't have enough evidence either way. And in addition to being paralyzed, we also are, if we followed Clifford's rule, forced to give up some things that no true moral system could possibly force us to give up, like love, like success, like religious belief, and even eternal life.